Hello there, I am Steve Wannall, and this is the Tavern Poker Guru, the podcast for the super amateur tournament poker player looking to perhaps one day make it to the big game. And today I'm going to be discussing something that I think is a pretty big hole in the games of a lot of amateur players. I know it was in mine, even for a brief moment, I suppose. But everybody struggles with this throughout a poker lifetime, I think. I am talking about the tough laydown. How to fold your hand when it's really, really strong, but you gotta let it go because it's beat. I think a lot of people can't do this. And I think it's a big, it's a turning point in a game when you can figure out how to let a hand go. Now, I've been playing in casual tournaments for a long time. We're talking Tavern League games and local firehouse charity poker events, that sort of thing. And I see a lot of casual play, like really casual play. We're talking a lot of people who are just treating it like a gambling game. You know, a lot of slots junkies, you know, who think they're gonna go into poker as well. And the problem with that is, like, tournament poker, it's not like just pressing buttons on a slot machine or buying a lottery ticket or waiting for your number to come up on Keno. You know, there's a lot more that goes into it. So let me just discuss what I think some of my really big turning points with this game were. For me, I think it was really back in 2008. Now, I'd already been playing poker for a while at this time. I'd been trying to, free roll my way to the main event of the World Series, which is pretty difficult. But 2008, the year of the first November 9, and I was eagerly watching this in the live broadcast on ESPN. And there was an interesting hand, I noted. It was between Ilan Schwartz and Ivan Demidov. And you can certainly find this, it's all over YouTube. But they're at the final table, November 9, millions of dollars on the line. And the hands were, I believe, Ace-10 versus King-Queen. But the important part was there was an Ace of Hearts and a King of Hearts involved. And they were in two different players' hands. And there were 3 hearts on the flop. The 4th heart hit the turn. And there was a flurry of big betting. And long story short, Ilan Schwartz, who was holding the second nuts at that point, was able to let it go. Now, if memory serves, it didn't happen until the river, actually, and the river did pair the board. It wasn't another heart, but so he didn't actually have to hold the second nuts. He had the second nut flush, but Ivan Demidov made a very big bet, holding the nut flush, and Ivan Demidov folded his hand. And this would have been a pot for the chip lead in the tournament. This was a big deciding factor in the tournament at this point. And I remember thinking at the time, oh my gosh, how did he make that laydown? How could he fold there? That to me was mind-boggling at the time. I was still fairly, new to my really strategic poker run. You know, I was still learning the game. I'd been playing it for some time in a casual setting, but I had only just begun researching it and really learning some of the finer strategies to it. And that kind of blew me away. Looking back on it, I can say, well, okay, no, that was really not that difficult to fold. It's still considered one of the epic laydowns of all time, I think. But I can look at it now and think, well, you're at the final table of the main event of the World Series of Poker. You are playing for millions of dollars. There's still plenty of people left at the table. This is for the chip lead. And you've got the second nut flush, but this guy is playing it like he has the nut flush. And the board just paired. Now, it was really unlikely that anybody had a full house or quads here, but, there were a number of factors that I look into it, and I think, I probably could have made that laydown. Now, at the time, that was not the case. There's no way I would have let that go. And that was a really big turning point for me. I began to think really hard of, like, how could he have let that go? And the more I looked into it, the more I started realizing some of the more subtle strategy involved. And some of the more obvious things that, at least things that should be obvious. So that was where I first really saw a big laydown. And I never thought I would find myself in a position like that. Obviously you play poker long enough, you're going to be in those positions. But I had been in positions like that before and not realized it because I'd made a bad call. I called with my set of fives or whatever, only to ignoring the fact that there were 4 to a straight or a flush on the board, and I'd been wrong, of course. Because I hadn't gotten to a point in my game where I could actually slow down and look at the board texture and consider what my opponent was doing and how they'd been playing the whole tournament. I didn't have all the ammunition available to me. If you're really playing like an astute poker player, you should be gathering an encyclopedia of information throughout the course of a tournament. You need to be tracking betting patterns. You need to be watching for people's tells if you're good at picking up on that sort of thing. You need to know the statistics of the hand, how many outs you have. You need to ask yourself the 2 important questions. What does my opponent likely have? What does he think I have? These are just basic things that, mantras that I have going into every single poker tournament now. But I didn't have that full toolbox available to me back then. So this is where I started developing, really looking at that hand and realizing, these guys are playing on a different level than I am. And I need to up my game. But I did get a chance. There was an interesting moment where I was in a Tavern poker league, one that I ultimately would end up doing pretty well in. And I don't recall the specifics of the people in the hand. This was years ago, of course, and I've played a lot of these games since then. But I do remember the actual hand, where I was in middle position, I believe, and we were in the later stages of the tournament. We were either with 2 tables on the bubble for the final table, or we were already at the final table. I can't recall. But I remember there was a shove all in from under the gun. And it was not a particularly huge chip stack shove, but it would have been enough to really damage me. Then the next person to act also shoved all in. And they did have me covered, so it would have cost my whole stack to get involved in this hand at this point. It folded around to me, and I looked down at pocket queens. And I'm somewhat short-stacked at this point, but I've got enough to hang around for a little while. And normally, this would have been an auto call. I'm looking to win the tournament. This is one of the better hands I've seen in a long time. It's pocket queens. It's incredibly strong, and you can't just let things like that go without giving it full consideration. But whereas the old me would have just snap called, I would have just said, oh yeah, this is the best hand I've got in a long time. I'm just going to throw this all in there. The new me was thinking, wait a minute, I need to actually read what's going on here. Now this was really tough because this was before the flop. I didn't have any equity in this hand at all. I didn't have a flop that told me you got a flush draw or a backdoor straight draw or anything like that, or I had 2 overs to the board. There was nothing like that. It was just 2 queens. That was all I was able to see, except for the action that had taken place ahead of me. And that action said, if you want to play, it's going to cost all of your chips. So that changed everything. And I really had to stop and think for a moment. And that was the big turning point for me. It was that I slowed down. I thought about it. And I said to myself, I'm likely calling here. But what's going on in this hand? Well, the first person who shoved all in was a pretty tight player. They had been very passive, doing a lot of calling to see flops and things like that, but they weren't very aggressive throughout the course of the tournament. Yet here they were committing their entire chip stack without any raise ahead of them. That was a big red flag. Now, it could have easily meant that, they had something like ace-king, ace-queen, pocket jacks, and hands that I would have at least stood a chance against. But who knows? It also could have been aces or kings. I don't know. The second player was a little more solid of a player, I think. But they weren't tremendously loose aggressive either. They were what I would classify also as a tight aggressive player, not so passive as the other person. So they were someone who were used to choosing their spots wisely and making good investments with their chips. And here they were shoving over the top of the other player. They were isolating. Now that sent a huge red flag up. And I started to think about it, and it's like, what could they possibly have? Well, it's possible that someone just had ace-king or ace-queen. It's possible they had lower pocket pairs. But with 2 people in that pot, I suddenly had to consider someone has got to have me beat here. It's very likely someone has aces or kings. And it helped that it was more than one person. If it was just one person who shoved ahead, I probably wouldn't have thought about it at all. I would have just shove the chips in and, taking my chances. But as it is, the likelihood that someone was ahead of me there was a lot higher. And even though there's only 2 hands that beat me at that point, aces and kings, the thought that this could be the end of my tournament and I still have to go up against 2 different players, we're close to the high ranks of this tournament, can I let go of queens here? And ultimately I decided, yeah, I think I can. And so I did. I folded queens. It was the first time I'd ever folded a hand as strong as pocket queens pre-flop. And I let it go. Everybody else folded. The 2 all-in players turned over their hand, and to my amazement, they had pocket aces and pocket kings. They both had me completely crushed. And I don't remember what the board turned out to be. I know I didn't improve on my queens at all, so I would have been eliminated. But it didn't matter. The point is, I had made the correct decision pre-flop and folded a really strong hand. So that was a big turning point for me, of realizing, wow, I'm a player who's capable of folding something as strong as pocket queens before a flop comes out. Now, I didn't have any chips invested, and because there were 2 players all in ahead of me already, I had more information. This is another reason that the power of position is so strong. Still a big turning point. That was a big moment. And the reason I bring all this up was something that happened recently, but I'm gonna get to that in just a minute, because there's one more example that I want to bring up here of someone who managed to do something that to this day I still haven't really had the opportunity to do. I'd like to believe that I could do it, but I haven't had the opportunity yet, and that's to lay down pocket kings pre-flop. Now, I don't know exactly what this tournament was. I believe it was sponsored by Party Poker, but it was a live tournament, like a brick-and-mortar tournament, and it was this amazing hand that you can find online, of course, but it featured a table of like 6 or 7 players, I guess, so it must have been a final table, but 5 of those players woke up with a pocket pair. Now that by itself is just alarming. That's something that I don't think I've ever seen happen in any other scenario, and I've played a lot of poker. So the action went like this. The earliest player to act was the one with pocket queens, and they put in a raise. A fairly substantial raise, I think. I don't really remember. But there was a raise from the player with pocket queens. The next player to act in the hand had pocket kings and put in a 3-bet. The next player after that had pocket aces and 4-bet the hand. So it's gone raise, raise, raise. And from that point on, the next 2 players to act, the first one had pocket 7s, and he just folded in frustration, in kind of disbelief, I guess. Shortly followed by the player with pocket 5s, who also easily got away from the hand. Now, at this point, this is where things got really interesting. Because of that action, the player with pocket queens, I think, was probably left short stack. They made the call, but the player with pocket kings looked at all that action around and let go of his hand. And I was amazed at this. It's like, because as hard as it was for me to fathom letting go of pocket queens pre-flop, letting go of pocket kings, that was something that I couldn't even conceive of. I was in the camp of, sometimes you're just going to get beat there. There's only one hand that's ahead of you pre-flop, and that's aces, and you can't let go of kings unless you absolutely put someone else on pocket aces. But with that kind of action at the table and the kind of reads that he must have been getting off even the 2 players who folded, that must have said to him, somebody's got aces, I'm behind. And, because you never know, those 2 players who folded, they were clearly giving off some kind of reactions because they had pocket pairs, but they could have had ace-king, they could have had king-queen, they might have been blocking some of his outs. Who knows? But for whatever reason, he figured it out and he got away from the hand before he put any more chips in, before any more cards came out. He let go of pocket kings pre-flop. And that was the first time I'd seen that happen. And as it turns out, the hand wound up being even more amazing because the queens and the aces wound up going heads up against each other. When the board rolled out, there was a king, so if the player with the kings had stuck around, he would have picked up a set of kings. Amazingly, though, the player with queens hit a queen on the river, And, now that I think about it, they weren't the short-stacked one. The aces were the short-stacked one, and they got eliminated. They had their aces cracked, and they were knocked out of the tournament. But the point of it is the player with the kings made the correct decision pre-flop, and he got away from the hand knowing that someone had aces there. And that's something that, now that I think of it, I have had the opportunity to let go of kings pre-flop. I've messed it up every single time. I have never been able to figure out that someone had aces when I had kings, or I've never been able to let it go beforehand. I remember the first time I ever went out to Las Vegas. I was at the Nationals for one of the Tavern leagues that I played in at the time, and I played in something like 7 different tournaments over the course of 4 or 5 days, and across those tournaments, I remember I had pocket kings 4 times, a total of 4 times in all of the tournaments that I played in. Every single time, one of the other players had pocket aces. And in at least 2 of those tournaments, that was how I exited the tournament. I got knocked out because the player had aces when I had kings. And let me tell you, that was frustrating. That was really frustrating. Cowboys are kind of called ace magnets for a reason. But to have them 4 times and every single time run into pocket aces, that's enough to make you want to flip the table and quit the game. Luckily, I have more restraint than that. And I also have the patience to try and get better at the game. And one of the things I thought of is, sometimes you just can't help that situation. You're just going to run into someone who has you crushed, and there's nothing you can do about it. And if your chip stack is short, you're never going to fold kings in that situation because it's your best chance to try and double up. It's, good hands come along so seldom in a poker tournament. And you don't want to squander those opportunities. So if you have something as strong as kings, you have something as strong as queens, you don't want to just let that go without considering, well, this should be the spot where I get it in, especially if you're short stacked. However, something I learned from that experience is that you need to be a little bit more proactive about not getting yourself into a situation where letting it go is going to hurt you, or you have no choice but to get it all in. One of the most amazing hands of poker that I ever saw was at another World Series main event, and it was Ben Lamb. I don't remember who he was up against. By the way, the hand that I just talked about with the ace of the 5 pocket pairs, if you want to look it up, I don't remember exactly all the details of it, but I know the players' names were Hickman, Kalakis, and O'Mahony, I believe, were the 3 who had the aces, kings, and queens. So that's, if you want to check that out, just look at aces versus kings versus queens and plug in those names. But the most amazing poker hand I saw with Ben Lamb and another player, I don't remember who it was, but I remember it was the main event of the World Series of Poker. And it was another case where it was aces versus kings. And the thing that was the most amazing about it to me was that it wound up being a really boring hand. Now, in Tavern poker, the kind of really casual, no buy-in events that I play on a regular basis, aces versus kings, there's going to be fireworks pretty much every single time. It's actually rare that you don't see all-in players. You could be at the very first blind level, and they're going to be shipping it all in. But this was a hand where there was just a raise, and a re-raise, and a call. And then on the flop, when nobody improved, there was a bet and a call. Then on the turn when nobody approved, there was a check and a bet and a call. It was very closed action poker. And after the river, no one had committed an enormous amount of their chips, but they were both slowly and carefully, in a measured way, building a pot, being careful not to get themselves pot committed in case they got cracked. And as it is, they just had a regular old showdown where they revealed their hands and the aces won, but nobody was really, really hurt by that. The kings, they didn't suffer too much from that. And that, to me, while it didn't make for great television, was really an amazing thing. I was like, wow, these guys, they're on a different level again. That was another moment where I said these guys are on a different level because they didn't get crazy with it. They knew that the best way to do it was to kind of small ball it, to slowly build a pot, not get yourself into a situation that you can't back out of. That's another really key thing that I think people don't tend to understand at the really amateur levels, is that you never get married to your hand. From my humble perspective, there are only a couple of scenarios where you want to get married to your hand. By married to your hand, I mean You are committed to putting all of your chips in this pot. You are not letting go of this hand no matter what happens. And, that's something that should rarely happen in tournament poker. And here's the times when I think that it's okay to get married to your hand. Okay? There's just two scenarios I can think of. One, you have the stone cold nuts. Meaning you have the absolute best hand that can be made using the cards that are on the board, and there are no cards that can come that will change that. Meaning no one can outdraw you. There is literally nothing that can show up that's going to unseat your hand as the best hand. Okay? At that point, sure, marry it. Take that hand to the altar. Because you're in great shape. At that point, you want to try and build a pot. You can play your game of, trying to extract as many chips as you can from people. Try and value bet so that you're not scaring people away. Or if you think they're going to call you, then step on the gas, put it all in there. But that is a scenario that comes up far less frequently than people believe it does. And a lot of people are also going to make the mistake of saying to themselves, well, I've got the nuts right now. They've got their 2 whole cards and then the 3 on the flop, but they forget that there's 2 more cards to come. And while what they have is the nuts right now, maybe they've got the nuts straight or something, but there's 2 cards to a flush on there. There's still 2 cards to come. The board could pair. There's all kinds of ways they can get beat. So that's something to consider. But, if you flop 4 of a kind on a rainbow board with no straights out there, then you've got the nuts. Even then, though, unless it's pocket aces, someone could still conceivably draw out on you. It'd be really hard, but you get what I'm saying here. If you have the stone cold nuts, if you know that there is nothing that can happen left in the hand, maybe you're already on the river, maybe you just flop something so strong it can't be outdrawn. But if you know that you can't be beat, then you can get married to your hand. But that's just one case. The second case, when you can get married to your hand, is if you are pot committed. Meaning the reward for you staying in the hand outweighs the risk by so much that you literally cannot afford to let it go. That means that, you've got 5 big blinds left in your stack, and you would win 15 big blinds if you made the call. That kind of thing. Or if you have so many outs and the pot is so big that it would literally be crazy not to stay in. That's a situation that you don't want to find yourself in. You would rather be in the hand and know that you were ahead. Or you would rather be in a situation where you can get the other player just to fold. Whatever. You want to be in a position where you can win the pot and it's not going to cost your tournament life, potentially, to make a play at it. So the real strategy then is to figure out how to avoid getting yourself in that spot to begin with. If you're pot committed, you're pot committed. And a lot of amateur players don't really understand what it means to be pot committed. I can't tell you how many players I've seen, they have 10,000 chips left in their stack and somebody bets 2,000 and they call. And then the turn hits and somebody bets 3,000 and they call. And then the river hits and now they've already invested, literally half of their stack into this pot. But, someone bets 5,000 on the river and they're not going to call because, they chased a draw or whatever. People don't understand that you can't just call your way to victory. Some people can, but it's not a winning strategy generally. You can do it sometimes. If you're at a table with a really aggressive person and you know that they're going to do all the betting for you and all you have to do is call with the best hand, you have to realize at that point you're trapping. You're trapping them. And if they're betting in you the whole way and you don't bet your whole stack on the river when they try and, they bet 50% of your stack, your remaining stack, to try and take it away from you and you're holding the nuts, you better be coming over the top of them, because you've trapped them. Because at that point, maybe they think, well, I now can't get away from this. But if you just call and call and call, and, especially if you're chasing a draw, your stack is just going to whittle down and down and down. And at some point, you literally cannot afford to do that anymore. If you're willing to call a raise that is worth 50% of your stack, then you have to ask yourself why it is you're in the hand. If you're just chasing a draw, if you're willing to put in more than 50% of your stack on a hand, you should be willing to put your whole stack in. That is the only thing that makes sense. Otherwise, you're either going to lose an enormous amount of chips when you decide to give it up, or you get beat and you'll be crippled, and then you'll have a really hard struggle to get back, or you're just playing the lottery. So if you have a sizable amount of chips, if you've invested a huge amount of your stack into the pot already, you got to be willing to put it all in there, because that's how you get the big chips. That's how you stay relevant in a tournament. So the trick is, don't get yourself in that position to begin with. Don't let yourself get pot committed if you don't know where you are. If you're not holding the nuts and you're not sure if you're beat or not, then you either need to try and control the pot size or get away from it, or be the aggressor. Get it all in there. Put the hard decision on your opponent. In general, that's the best thing you can do. As long as you're not being completely crazy about it, if you're not on a complete airball bluff against somebody who's proven they're not going to fold. There was a big nationals tournament that I went to for one of the Tavern leagues once, where I was keeping a poker journal. It was one of the big ones that one of the first experiences I've been where I had a real shot at getting to the World Series, or at least making some money in some of the side tournaments. And I remember keeping a journal with me, and my mantra for that weekend was pot control, pot control, pot control. Because I wanted to make sure that I was giving myself every opportunity to win the pot by seeing things cheaply when I wasn't sure where I was, but also building up a pot that was worth winning when I knew I was strong. And that's another thing that I think a lot of people don't really get. But that's a huge thing. A book I can recommend. I can't recommend it highly enough. I believe it's just an ebook, like a Kindle book. But it's by Annie Duke and Robert Varconi. It's called The Middle Zone. And there's a lot of description about precisely what that means. Long story short, if you're in the middle zone, it means you don't really know where you are. You don't have the nuts, which is easy to play, and you don't have the worst possible hand, which is also easy to play. You're somewhere in this gray area where you might be ahead and you might not. And there's a lot of different examples of what you should do in various middle zone situations. But again, long story short, you want to try and control the pot size. You want to try and step on the gas when you know you're ahead. You want to hit the brakes when you don't think you are. Controlling the pot size mainly means keeping the action closed. It means checking when you're out of position, just calling when you're in position. Don't open up the action to a situation where you might get re-raised and then have a tough decision. And if someone's betting large into you, then, you got some more tough decisions to make, but you don't want to try and provoke a situation where you're not sure what you're going to do. If you don't know how you're going to react to being re-raised, then you need to really carefully consider how you're going to play a hand. But anyway, that's sort of a tangent. We're still talking about tough laydowns, right? Well, there's one more I want to discuss, and it's the reason for my choosing this topic. Just this past weekend, very recently, I competed in a very large regional tournament for the main Tavern league that I play in. And it was a large tournament. There were 176 players. And I got down to the final table. And I was up against the chip leader at the time. And I was maybe second or third in chips. I had a very nice stack myself. And it was early on in nine-handed play. And from under the gun, a player made a very large raise, and my being on the button, I had ace-queen of clubs. Now, normally, in this position, I'm going to be 3-betting there. This is something I'd done throughout the entire tournament at that point, which is, I think, one of the reasons I was able to make it to the final table. I'd been very aggressive. I'd taken advantage of a lot of spots, and I'd used position very, very well. And, here I am on the button with a very strong hand, and, my first instinct is to 3-bet there and try and get the betting lead going into the flop. But in this particular instance, I elected to just call, and I did this for a variety of different reasons. First and foremost, I was up against the chip leader. It was one of the few people, one of the one or two people at the table who could actually take me out of the tournament. So I didn't want to open myself up to a re-raise, just like that middle zone position that I was telling you about before. Secondly, the blinds were really high at this point. Putting in any kind of raise meant a significant investment of chips. So I figured, let's not do it all pre-flop. Let's see where we are after the flop. Also, this was a player I happened to be very, very familiar with, and I know he was under the gun. I knew he wasn't going to be making that move without a real monster, and he's also the kind of guy who was probably willing to get it all in pre-flop if he thought he was ahead of me. So I just called. And also, we're at the final table. I wanted to win this thing. There were still 8 players between me and the title. So I was going to take a little more measured response here. So I just called with my ace-queen suited. So on the flop, there was an ace. I'd paired my ace, but he comes out firing again. And now the warning flags are kind of going up. I've got a really, really strong hand. I've got top pair with a really good kicker. But I'm still behind a couple of hands here. If he's got pocket aces, he's got ace-king, I'm in big trouble here. Now, I didn't want to let it go because, as I said before, these good hands only come along once in a great while, and you don't want to give up the opportunity. So I just called again, because this is that middle zone situation I'm telling you about. And on the turn, he fires again, but this time it's all in. And it's for my entire stack. Now, I've got a terrible decision here because I've got a really strong hand, but it's going to cost my entire tournament life if I want to continue. And amazingly, while I'm sitting there thinking about it, the tournament goes on a break. So I decide I'm going to take my time, and I'm really going to think this out because I've actually got the time to think about this. No one's going to call a clock on me. Half the people are already getting up to take their break. So I really went into the tank for a long time, and I considered everything, absolutely everything. I looked at all the chip stacks around the table and said, who's ahead of me right now? Who's behind me? Well, who's still relevant to this thing? If I fold here, how many chips will I have left? If I win it, how big of a chip leader will I be? Because that was not in question that I would be the chip leader. Do I have any cards that can come that will help me? I had to think of everything. And also, going back to this is the chip leader, he was out of position. He never once indicated that he was at all afraid of where he was in this hand. He stepped on the gas the whole way. And this, one other factor to consider, this player is someone that I have a history with, a very specific history. In a regional just a while before this one, the two of us wound up heads up together, and it was an even bigger tournament. There were like 224 people in that tournament, and we came in first and second place, respectively. He won that regional, and it's always been kind of a sore spot for me because I felt I had gotten so close, and I had played that tournament so well, and I really wanted that win, but he took it away from me. And, not to say he took it away from me. He well earned it. He's a very good player. But here we were in this situation again, and I'm thinking, I want to get to a heads-up rematch with this guy. And I know he kind of wanted it too. We'd sort of made a pact earlier in the week. He said, hey, if we get a chance, let's go heads-up again. And, which is kind of ridiculous because there's, easily a couple hundred people in these regionals, and there were 176 in this one. So the idea that we would even ever be at the same table with one another was kind of ridiculous. But here we were again, both at the final table. And we both had big stacks. We had a real shot at actually getting that heads-up rematch. And here he was kind of jeopardizing it when we were still 9-handed, which told me he's not jeopardizing this at all. He knows he's ahead of me. So I went into the tank for a long, long time, and I thought it out, and I was able to narrow it down. I said, what am I ahead of? Well, I'm ahead of ace-jack, ace-10, weaker aces, but there aren't that many that he would have played that way. I'm absolutely crushed if he's got pocket aces or ace-king, which is unlikely, especially pocket aces, but it's the only story that makes sense right now. It's possible he was aggressive under the gun with a smaller pocket pair and flopped a set. It didn't look good for me. And also, again, final table. I was also deep enough with my chip stack that I could fold and be okay. It wasn't going to completely cripple me to let it go. And as much as it pained me to let this opportunity to go when I had position on him and I had, such a strong hand that I flopped, I also remembered a little note from one of the early poker pros that I paid attention to, which was Phil Gordon. I read all of his early books, and they were instrumental in getting me to develop some basic strategy. I think some people might think that they're sort of dated now with the way that poker has changed over the years, but I think it's still a very good foundation, especially in the amateur games that I'm used to frequenting. But one of the sage pieces of advice that Phil Gordon gave is never go broke with one pair. And Just listening to that piece of advice has saved me in a lot of different situations over the years. And that flashed through my head here. And, looking back on it now, again, this was kind of an easy decision, especially considering everything that was at stake. But at the time, it hurt. It hurt to let it go. And I think that is one of the biggest obstacles for an amateur player trying to make a tough fold, is that, it hurts us to let it go. We want to be validated. We want to feel like we were right. We want to be able to win a pot and say, hey, I got you, even if it was just pure luck and you sucked out. It's like, you still get that validation that you won the pot. It doesn't matter how wrong you were to be playing in the first place. People tend to ignore that really quickly. People have incredibly selective attention. We tend to pay attention to the things that validate what we were thinking, even if they're negative things. When you bust out of a tournament, you're always like, oh, I was just card dead the whole time. Or like, everybody kept sucking out on me, or the people played so bad and I had them outplayed, but they just kept, getting, we tend to go with whatever narrative makes us feel better about our own choices, because we don't like looking like an idiot in front of other people. And that is something that influences our decisions far more than it should at a poker table. I, however, was not thinking about how I was going to look in this particular situation. I was thinking solely, can I survive this if I call? Am I actually ahead here? And increasingly, the answer was just no. And at one point, I think he even said something along the lines of, I've got you out-kicked here. And that told me, oh, he's got ace-king. He's got no other hand but ace-king. And finally, after mourning the loss of the hand, realizing that, it was okay to mourn it and let it go, to go through the stages of grief that I was going to have to let this hand go. And I just laid it down. I folded it face up. I just said, good hand, and I turned over the ace-queen. I showed my pair of aces. He turned over his hand as well, and sure enough, he had ace-king. He had me totally crushed. There was only one card to come. I only had 3 outs. It was absolutely the right laydown. Now, another player who's also an amateur, who has quite a bit less experience than I do, but he's got some good instincts, and he's really shown that he wants to learn the game a little bit more, and I had also knocked him out in 10th place. He was standing behind me, and he was amazed. He could not believe I had made that laydown, and suddenly realized, oh, this is where I was years ago when I saw that hand between Ilan Schwartz and Ivan Demidov, and I couldn't believe he'd made that laydown. That's where he was now. He couldn't believe I'd let that go. And ultimately, I explained to him the whole thought process that I had and how I was able to whittle down the range and realize that there's just no other story that made sense here and that I had to be behind. It seemed kind of elementary to me at that point. And I realized that, wow, I'd really come a long way. I have a long way to go as far as learning this game and getting better at this game. But I think if you ask any of the top pros in the world, they'll tell you that as well. The best players are the ones who are always going to be looking at themselves. They're always going to be taking their own game apart. They're not going to be blaming their shortcomings on, the folly of the other players around them. They're going to take a look at it and say, what can I do to improve myself? How do I make my game better so that even when people are terrible around me, it doesn't affect me that much? That's a pretty good allegory for life, too, I think. But that's what it takes. I think if you want to improve your game, if you're an amateur, and even if you're playing at the lowest of low-stakes games like I am, and you want to improve your game, I think that's what you need to do. You need to take a look at yourself, find the holes in your game, and figure out how to plug them. Now, that's a daunting task. It's a lifelong task. But it's really, really simple if you just take it one little bite-sized chunk at a time. And this chunk this week is think about what it takes to make a tough laydown. Can you make the tough laydown? Because you're going to save a lot of money. It feels like you're losing when you're folding, like you've given up. Because everybody wants to play. When they get into these things, they, especially the most amateur players, they get into a game of poker, they want to play poker. They want to see every flop. They want to get their chips in. They want to be actively doing something. And when you start getting good at this game and you realize it takes a lot of patience and a lot of folding, for an amateur player who's just starting out, or even someone who's just, they just want to go out on a Tuesday night and have fun and, get a couple of drinks and play some poker, that just seems like a really boring waste of time. It is, however, how you get better at the game. If you have patience, and if you really choose your spots and then you play them aggressively when you do decide to play, that's where the strength comes in. So while it feels like losing when you're folding, I feel like I should write a book called Folding is Winning because in the big poker tournaments, and a lot of these, I should preface this by saying that most of these tavern leagues, they're qualifiers for bigger tournaments. These are things that send people to the World Series of Poker or to World Poker Tour events or, the big games, the big money buy-ins, the things where you can make hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And if you're going to really be prepping to play in those games, if you're playing in a tavern league because you want to get to those games, then you really got to think about what those games are going to be like, because I promise you it's not going to be like playing in a tavern. You want to get deep in those big games, the thing you're going to be doing more often than anything else is folding. Even the really active players, the really, really loose, aggressive players who like beating up the table and being the table captain and just getting in with, they'll just mix it up with any two cards and then try and talk their way into a victory or bully people with their chips, to try and win. Even they are going to be doing folding. They're going to fold more than they do anything else. Folding is the single most used play in tournament poker. So that's something you got to consider. And most of the time it's easy, you got 7 deuce offsuit under the gun. It's the easiest fold in the world. But when you've got pocket kings and there are 3 all-ins ahead of you, that gets to be a pretty tough situation. And there's a lot of people who are going to say, no, you can't ever fold pocket kings in that situation. In fact, I had that conversation with a couple of people at that final table at the regional this past weekend where they said, no, you're never folding pocket kings in that situation. You just got to take your chances. And I respectfully had to disagree. I think a lot of times you can't let it go because you can't let go of that opportunity, especially if you're in a situation against people who are going to be shoving weak. If you've got them covered, sure. There's a lot of situations where you might decide to call there, but there's going to be some situations where you might decide, I'm actually beat here. Someone's got aces. So you really have to consider every single factor. That's what it takes to make a tough laydown. If I'm going to leave you with any piece of advice for plugging a hole in your game, in even a casual game, learn how to let go of a hand that is likely beat. Sometimes it's easy. If you flop a set, but there ends up being 4 cards to a suit that you don't have in your hand and someone's going all in on you, that's a little bit easier. If you don't have the flush, you can't call there. But in that situation, and in the more difficult ones, my advice is give yourself permission to mourn the loss of your hand and let it go. I'm Steve Wannall. This is the Tavern Poker Guru. Thanks for listening.